And I'll bring into this conversation now Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired and president of Cedric Leighton Associates, friend of the show. Thank you for being here, Colonel, as always.
My pleasure, Jonathan. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. I want to talk to you about Senator McCain's comments earlier this week calling for foreign air power to be used in Syria. But first of all, I just want to stick with Iran. What is your view of how successful any military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities could be?
Well, I think success on the basis of a strike would really depend on how well the strike is planned. Whenever the U.S. goes into any area, there's a lot of planning that goes on. For example, in the run-up to the shock and awe phase of Iraqi freedom, there were lots of exercises that were conducted on the air side as well as on the ground side, and the maritime forces also had a role in those. So the planning is very extensive. It's almost like choreographing a ballet. It's a very, very difficult piece to pull off, but once it's done, it can be extremely successful if we know all of the targets and if we know exactly what is in each of those target areas. And by that I really mean how these targets are constructed. One of the key articles about this was in The Economist this week, and it talked about the type of concrete that the Iranians use, and they've actually done a lot of research in a hardened form of concrete. It's actually called ultra-hardened concrete. And it is a very difficult type of cement to penetrate using conventional munitions. And that's the kind of thing that has to be analyzed both from an intelligence perspective as well as from an operational testing perspective before you can really say whether or not a strike would be successful. My personal view is that a strike could be very successful as long as there is enough practice and as long as the air crews know exactly what they're doing and they know exactly which targets to hit, and we're not surprised by any secret targets that the Iranians have. I mean, they're all secret, but ones that we don't know about.
And Colonel, from your experience and knowledge, does Israel have as much capability as the United States does for this particular type of operation that would be needed?
No, they do not. They are very good. The Israelis are very, very good when it comes to single targets. For example, the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 1981, where they eliminated the Iraqi nuclear weapons program, and they did the same thing with Syria back in 2007. Each one of those targets was a single target. The Israelis knew exactly where they wanted to go. They knew the types of munitions that would be required, and they had those munitions. Those targets were not the hardened targets that we're talking about with Iran. And in this case, they talk about hardened and deeply buried targets. So not only are they hardened in terms of the concrete that they use, but they also are hardened in terms of the fact that they're buried underground. And the Iranians have done this deliberately to protect their nuclear weapons development program. Anybody who does peaceful research in the nuclear field doesn't really need those kinds of facilities. And that's what we're seeing unfolding here in front of our eyes right now.
All right, let's turn to Syria, Colonel. And before I get your thoughts, I want to play a couple of bits of sound from the hearing yesterday. First of all, Leon Panetta on whether the U.S. should take unilateral action in Syria. Here's the Defense Secretary.
What doesn't make sense is to take unilateral action at this point. As Secretary of Defense, before I recommend that we put our sons and daughters in uniform in harm's way, I've got to make very sure that we know what the mission is. I've got to make very sure that we know whether we can achieve that mission, at what price, and whether or not it'll make matters better or worse.
And then we heard, of course, from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Martin Dempsey, when he was asked the question, can the U.S. act in Syria? Here's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
I want to be clear. We can do anything. The question is, so it's not about can we do it, it's should we do it, and what are the opportunity costs elsewhere and what are the risks?
So, Colonel, what do you make of this sort of political disagreement here? Influential senators like John McCain suggesting that there needs to be foreign air power, airstrike's the only way to go forward, and the U.S. should lead that campaign as it did in Libya. Clearly, the Defense Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs not so keen on that sort of action. What's your view?
Well, I think the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman are correct in saying that this needs to be a coalition effort. Senator McCain is looking at this from the standpoint of the U.S. has practically always led these kinds of operations, and we have the expertise to do so, and he's correct in that area. So it's a matter of really fusing both views. What happens when you put these things together, from a diplomatic standpoint, it becomes very, very important that there be a coalition built around the region. Basically, what you want to do is you want to encircle Syria as much as you possibly can, and you would look to countries like Turkey, Jordan, possibly even Iraq, even though that one is questionable, to work that particular aspect of it. The other part of it is you have the humanitarian crisis, and that is the part that Senator McCain talked about a great deal in his remarks, was the fact that right now we have approximately 7,500 people who are, according to UN reports, who have been killed as a result of the activities of the Assad regime. When you look at that and then you think, these armed elements of the Assad regime continue to have a capability that is supplied by the Russians, by the Chinese, and of course by the Iranians, then you take a look and see that if they don't, if nothing is done, then the slaughter will continue, and that, I think, is the Senator's main worry. But from a military planning perspective, it becomes an extremely difficult endeavor because we have never focused on Syria before as a potential target. One of the reasons, I suspect, is an institutional one, and that is because although Syria is in the Central Command area of responsibility, it borders onto the European Command area of responsibility. So it's basically at the seam of responsibility areas between two combatant commands. One part and parcel of NATO, the other one, of course, centered on the Middle East. That would be Central Command. And so you're looking at some institutional issues that have to be overcome within the U.S. military, institutional issues that have to be overcome within NATO, and, of course, a willingness on the part of the United States and other nations to move forward against the Syrian regime in spite of the failure of diplomatic actions within the UN Security Council. So those are the kinds of factors that play into this. Based on the remarks that the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman made, I would say that the planning has not reached the stage yet where they feel confident that they can go in with a coalition of the willing to actually do the job. But time is running out, and they need to work that issue very, very quickly.
All right, very interesting. Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired and president of Cedric Leighton Associates. Great to have you with us, as always, Colonel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be with you.
All right.